Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Pastor Eli James here once again, and this is going to be part 2 of our 3-part series of the identification of the Jewish people versus the Israelite people of the Bible. And of course, you have all been taught that the Jews and the Israelites are the same people. However, the Bible tells us a completely different story, and what this part is going to be entitled as is the great impersonation of Israel by the Jews. And we can start our story way back in Genesis chapter 4, where Cain has already been thrown out of the garden for killing Abel. And in verse 18, we are told, let me back up here. What was it? Firstlings, after. This Bible I don't have marked. I want to go on with his descendants. Okay, where did they start? 16. Okay. All right, so if you got it still rolling, I'll just keep going here. Okay. In Genesis 4:16, we're told, "And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begot Mehujael, and Mehujael begot Methusael, and Methusael begot Lamech." So immediately in these verses we are given the descendants of Cain. And in chapter 5 of Genesis, we are given the descendants of Seth, who was the replacement for Abel, whom Cain slew. And the Bible is giving us 2 completely separate and distinct genealogies, one from Seth and one from Cain. And we're going to demonstrate to you that the genealogy descending from Cain will result in the people known today as the Jewish people. As far as the descendants of Seth are concerned, all you have to do is look at Luke chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 1, and you will be given the entire genealogy from Adam all the way down to Jesus Christ. Now, the Jewish people have a completely different genealogy, which is utterly unrelated to the genealogy of the Sethites. And in Genesis 15, verses 18 through 21, we are told that of these nations that were cast out from the Garden of Eden and related to Cain, and it tells us, in that same day, this is Genesis 15, verses 18 through 21, "In that same day Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham, saying, Unto thy seed," the seed of Abraham being a direct descendant of Seth, "Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt until the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaims being the descendants of the fallen angels of chapter 6, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." So Yahweh is telling Abraham that these are the nations that he wants the descendants of Abraham to overthrow, because they're living in the land of Canaan now, which Yahweh wants his people, the Israelites, to possess. Of course, the Israelites would first be taken into captivity in Egypt, and only after the exodus from Egypt would they take possession of this land. And I want you to understand very clearly that this land was possessed by these people, which I just named from Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 through 21. Now, the first named people in this list are the Kenites. Who are the Kenites? the Kenites are the descendants of Cain. That's clearly what the Bible tells us. If you look up Strong's Concordance, look up the term Kenite, and you will find it is defined as descendant of Cain. Now, people have been taught that there weren't any survivors of Noah's flood. It's very common to be taught that the flood was global. However, that is an incorrect teaching. The Bible teaches no such thing as this. It does not teach that the waters of the flood reached the top of Mount Everest. In fact, it only tells us that we're talking about the local area, because the face of the earth described in this chapter 6, is the same expression used of Cain when he was driven off the face of the earth from the garden. So it's not talking about the planet, it's simply talking about the region. And even in Genesis chapter 6, it tells us very clearly that there were giants in those days before the flood and after the flood. Let me see if I can find the exact verse here. It's better to quote it. Yes. And so let me quote here. I'm going to quote Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, which is not talking about the entire planet. It's only talking about that area where they were. And daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God, which is translated from Ben Elohim, meaning the fallen angels, saw that the daughters of Adam, we're talking about the Sethites here, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And Yahweh said, My spirit shall not always strive with Adam, the descendants of Adam, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. We know that the lifespans of the ancient patriarchs were much longer before the flood than afterwards. And then it says in verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that is after the flood as well. And we know that Goliath, being a descendant of the tribe of Gath, and I just quoted in Genesis chapter 15 that the Rephaim were on the face of the earth and living in the land of Palestine, or Canaan land at that time. So they were alive after the flood. So either if the flood theory, global flood theory is correct, then all of these people miraculously reappeared, or they survived, in which clearly it is the case that they survived, as Genesis 6:4 tells us. Also the book of Jasher tells us that the many survived the flood and fled and escaped to another land. And therefore we find in Genesis chapter 15 that these Kenites, who are the descendants of Cain, are indeed alive and well in the land of Canaan. So now of these tribes, only 7 survived, and we're going now to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7. Because Deuteronomy chapter 7 gives us a number of details of these Kenite tribes and what happened to them, and how the Israelites are supposed to relate to them. Deuteronomy 7, verse 1. When Yahweh thy Elohim shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, I've already given the names, but here it repeats some of them, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater than and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, shalt thou smite them, nor show mercy unto them. So, in other words, since these tribes are literal descendants of the fallen angels, and had intermarried with the peoples of the territory, that these forbidden creatures were not part of Yahweh's plan for this earth. These, in fact, were a hybrid nation created by the fallen angels. And this is how we are to understand these verses. And later on, in verse 7, the Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the fewest of all people. Talking about Noah's flood, there were only 8 of our ancestors left at that point. but because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of the bondmen, for the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt. Know therefore that Yahweh thy Elohim, he is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love him, and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. So folks, we have to keep his commandments, and we are told numerous times in the Bible, Old and New Testament, that we must keep his commandments. The law has not been done away with. That's another false teaching of the modern churches. And it repayeth them that hate him to their face. Okay, so if you hate your God, he will repay you accordingly. To destroy them, we are told. He will not be slack to him that hateth him. He will repay him to his face. Thou shalt therefore keep the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which I command me to this day. Okay, and hold on, I have to find out the verse where he says, thou shalt not make marriages. Okay, yes, here we go. Now, in verse 3 of Deuteronomy chapter 7, it tells us, we Israelites, neither shalt thou make marriages with them, that is, these Kenite people. Thy daughter thou shalt not give to his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of Yahweh be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly. Now this is exactly what happened to the northern 10 tribes of Israel. They started to make marriages with these Canaanites, and because of this, Yahweh drove them from the face of Palestine, the northern 10 tribes area that they inhabited, and they cast them out into the wilderness of Europe. So here, the sin that they committed is the sin of race mixing with non-Israelites. And if we read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we find out very clearly that Ezra and Nehemiah cleaned the house of all the race-mixed people, and would accept only as citizens of Judah those people who did not have mixed-race children. Deuteronomy chapter 23 clearly tells us that we shall not have mixed-race offspring come into our congregation. It clearly tells us this. I know those pastors will tell you that the word there is bastard. A bastard shall not enter the congregation of God. But if you look that word up, bastard, it's the Hebrew mamzer. It has only one meaning. It means mongrel. No mongrel shall enter the congregation of Yahweh. All the churches that are teaching you that race mixing and mongrelization is acceptable to God are lying to you, folks. The Bible does not teach any such thing. And they are using these lies to oppress you, the true Adamites and Israelites of the Bible. Until you understand this truth, that these churches have become actually your enemies, you will not understand what's going on in the world today. Because what we see is the world empire of merchants, Mystery Babylon, as ruled by the Jewish bankers, the bankers of the house of Rothschild. These are the ones promoting all these lies. These are the ones promoting this mythology that they are God's chosen people, even though they violate every law of the Old Testament, every single law of the Old Testament. Their holy book is the Talmud, not the Old Testament. And the Talmud is virtually step by step the entire denial of the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 4:2 clearly tells every priest, you shall not change the Lord's laws. You shall not change one word that I have given you. You shall not add, you shall not subtract from the written word that I have given you. These are the words of Moses, folks. So if a rabbi comes along and tells you, well, I can change the law because I'm a rabbi, he is a liar. He is a deceiver. He is leading you down the path to destruction and encouraging you to follow him. Now, I want to show that the New Testament completely verifies the teachings of the Old Testament. In fact, we have this strain of Christianity which claims that the Old Testament is obsolete, and if we don't really need the Old Testament, and it's just for our instruction. And even those people who claim that it's for the instruction, they have thrown it away and refuse to be instructed by it. So I want to show that these Christians are absolutely wrong, because the New Testament cannot be understood without an understanding of the Old Testament. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I'm going to quote the entire chapter because this is probably the most important prophecy in the New Testament concerning the second coming. Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by our gathering together